Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Andy Shoemaker, the founder of Nimbus DDoS, and today I'll be talking about some of the most common DDoS incident response mistakes and what you can do to avoid them. Before we dig into the presentation, I want to mention that there will be a Q&A session at the end, so if you have any questions, please post them in the webinar chat and we will try to answer them all at the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's get started. First, please take note of my contact information on this slide. If you would like to discuss the webinar or you have any DDoS questions, please feel free to email me or connect with me on LinkedIn. Now, we do have a lot of material to cover in today's webinar, but before we do that, I want to quickly introduce myself and Nimbus DDoS. Specifically, I want to mention that I have over 20 years of denial of service experience and over 15 years of operations experience. Now, what this means is that I have a deep understanding of both the technical and the business aspects of a DDoS attack. And I've been involved with DDoS attacks from the defender and the security researcher points of view. So yes, this does mean that I have personally created DDoS source code, and I know them at a very, very deep level. Now, as for my company, I founded Nimbus DDoS to help enterprises be more proactive and prepared for DDoS attacks. I like to say that we do everything except mitigation. Most people think being DDoS prepared is simply buying some hardware or a service, but like many areas of cybersecurity, there are processes and people that must be set up to maximize the value of any technology solution. Our big product is our testing platform. This is a platform that lets our customers launch controlled, real-world DDoS attacks against their own environment to test their defenses. So to answer the question you're probably thinking, yes, we launch legal DDoS attacks every day, which is pretty cool. Now, I won't go into detail, but we also have some related services like risk assessments and training. The point is that we can handle the proactive side of being DDoS prepared and work in a vendor-neutral manner with your mitigation vendors. To make sure that we are all working from the same starting point, I'm going to kick off this webinar with some very high-level DDoS information. Now, even people familiar with DDoS attacks, I still encourage you to take note of the information since there are many misconceptions when it comes to DDoS attacks. Now, DDoS obviously stands for Distributed Denial of Service. But what do we mean by that? The important part is the denial of service part. And what we mean is any cybersecurity attack that prevents a legitimate user from accessing a resource. Now that sounds obvious, but there is some nuance to that. First off, when we say resource, we mean any resource. People often think of a denial of service attack targeting a website, but a denial of service attack could target an email server, a database, a phone system, or any other network-connected endpoint. Second, people often think of denial of service attacks as a huge amount of traffic that floods the target. Now, this is often the case, but it doesn't need to be. In fact, some of the earliest attacks back in the mid and late 1990s were just a handful of packets that would cause the target system to crash. And very small layer 7 attacks today continue to cause significant outages for even large companies. Now, why do DDoS attacks work? The simple answer is that they exhaust some finite resource that is critical to application delivery. Just as with our last slide, the answer seems simple, but there is some nuance to this as well. On the right side of the slide, you can see a simplified version of a common network stack. You have a router at the edge, then a firewall, a load balancer, and some application servers. What a DDoS attack does is it overwhelms some resource in that critical path. So for instance, the attacker doesn't need to take the load balancer offline if they can figure out a way to overwhelm the firewall or the servers or some other component in that pathway. Literally any component in the path could be targeted. I also want to pause here for a moment to call out another big misconception about DDoS attacks. Most people think of attacks as network exhaustion attacks where you fill up the internet circuit. This is certainly one type of DDoS attack, but many resources could be targeted, and I've listed a few here such as CPU, memory, or even storage performance. Now with the technical overview done, let's talk a little bit about the business impacts of DDoS attacks. It's important to understand the business impacts as this is what dictates the organization's response to an attack. You can imagine that there might be some small business that wouldn't be impacted at all by a DDoS attack. So obviously they aren't going to spend much time or money protecting themselves. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have a financial services company that has a massive potential impact. So they will spend significantly more time and money defending against a DDoS attack. Now, where your company falls is somewhat subjective, but I've listed some common impacts to consider. So take a look at this list and first ask yourself, which impacts would you have during an attack? Then ask yourself, how do you quantify that impact? I think the impact people are most familiar with is a direct financial loss during an attack. For many online businesses, downtime causes a drop in revenue. This is especially true of e-commerce, online media, and SaaS companies. But there are other more sinister impacts that often go unrecognized. For example, the damage of reputation or the lost productivity of an IT team. These costs are harder to quantify, and they cost the company indirectly. Similarly, there are scenarios where a DDoS attack can help conceal a data theft, which, depending on your data, that could be so devastating as to put your company out of business. And of course, for those in the financial services sector or other heavily regulated industries, there is of course the indirect cost of regulatory scrutiny that comes with an attack. So as you can see, the business impacts can be very broad, and one of the first steps to being prepared is to understand the risks within your environment, because that's the primary driver that shapes what your defenses should look like. Now, based on the last slide, it seems pretty obvious that even for small businesses, our objective is to minimize the business impact. And the most obvious way to do this is to reduce the time during which an attack is impacting the business. So let's talk about incident response. On this slide, I've shown what I call the mitigation path, which is detection, followed by mitigation, followed by analysis. Now, this seems simple enough, right? You detect an attack, then you take some defensive action, and once complete, you look back and see how you can do better or improve. But by now, you probably realize that there is more to it than that, and there is some nuance that needs to be considered. First, how does detection work? Did you know that nearly all incident response teams misclassify DDoS attacks as some other form of network outage? They do. And the reason I know this is because when Nimbus DDoS tests a company's defenses, we routinely see NOC personnel rebooting routers and firewalls because they think that the device has crashed or is some sort of software bug. And I'll show you some timing info on this in some of the following slides. The second item, mitigation. It also seems pretty straightforward. Again, it's not as simple as it seems. Mitigation hardware and services vendors are all very different. Some are operating in an always-on manner, while others might require some form of activation. Some solutions may be heavily automated, while others rely on manual processes. All of these significantly impact how long an attack will impact a business. And in the upcoming slides, I'll give you some hard numbers on that. Now, in that previous slide, I said detection can be challenging. And I'm sure there are people wondering, how is that possible, since a DDoS attack should be very obvious just from looking at network traffic. But this goes back to something I mentioned earlier, how there is a misconception that DDoS attacks always involve a large volume of traffic. So look at the two graphs on this slide. In the graph on the left, I have a 1 gigabit circuit, and we see a sudden jump in bandwidth at around 2213 hours. So the internet circuit is saturated and very likely is due to a DDoS attack. But what about the graph on the right? Here we see outbound traffic drop at about 0248, while inbound traffic remains about the same. Now, this pattern doesn't immediately suggest a DDoS attack to most people, and this is where misdiagnosis occurs. The graph on the right is in fact a DDoS attack. It's actually a low-volume SYN flood that overwhelmed the environment's firewall. So not the circuit, but the firewall. Let's look at a second example. On this slide, we have two packet captures. On the left side, the packet capture shows a large number of UDP packets with a very large packet size of 1400 bytes, and they're all destined to the NTP port. A few things jump out that suggest an obvious DDoS attack. First, the packet size is fixed, and it's also very large, which is very unusual for real NTP traffic. Second, the packet capture couldn't decode the data in the packet, and it simply notes unspecified rather than showing real NTP data. But what about the packet capture on the right? In this packet capture, we see a lot of DNS queries being sent to the DNS port. The sizes of the packets are variable, and they seem legitimate. And the packets contain real DNS requests. You can see A record requests, MX records requests, etc. Of course, this is also a DDoS attack. The difference is that this is what we call a layer 7 or an application layer attack. These attacks masquerade as legitimate traffic and are very difficult to detect and block. So I mentioned earlier that we see a lot of good and bad during our testing. What I'm going to show you are the incident response times for two hypothetical scenarios that are based on things we have seen across various customer tests. First, let's take a look at a hypothetical incident response that relies on manual mitigation approaches. Naturally, procedures can vary from company to company, but this is a common design that we see. And as we step through the process, take note of the time estimates. Often, a DDoS incident response will be initiated by an alert from a network monitoring system or a mitigation solution. And some perform better than others. The most common mechanism that we see is an email or an SMS page being sent to the organization's SOC. The average that we see for this step is about 10 minutes, with top performers at around 5 minutes, and 30 minutes or more for the bottom performers. The main driver for time on this step is usually determined by whether the organization has a 24/7 SOC or not, and the level of training in incident response procedures for that team. Now, once the SOC receives the alert, they generally need to validate that a real event is occurring and that the alarm is not a false positive. Again, this step can vary in duration, and what we generally see is that larger organizations are slower during this step. Now, this may sound a little counterintuitive, but in larger organizations, the SOC will often need to escalate to other engineers to actually validate the alarm and the environment impact. The average that we see for this validation step is about 15 minutes, with top performers running about 10 minutes and poor performers at around 40 minutes. And this is also where the misdiagnosis that I mentioned earlier will often become apparent. Now at this point, the SOC has validated that an attack is occurring, so now they must activate either mitigation solutions. They must activate their mitigation solutions. As with the last step, usually large companies perform poorly at this step as well, and that's because escalation to an engineer with proper access to perform the mitigation is usually needed. Additionally, the type of mitigation solution may affect the timing as well. So for instance, if you require DNS changes or BGP routing updates to redirect the traffic through a mitigation solution, this can easily tack on an extra 10 minutes or more to the timeline. Now with our customers, we see on average about 10 minutes with top performers and bottom performers at 5 minutes and 35 minutes respectively. So at this point, we now hopefully are back online. I do say hopefully because sometimes initial mitigation efforts fail and manual adjustments by the organization's engineers or the mitigation vendor may be needed. I'm not going to list times for that, but suffice it to say that Nimbus DDoS and real-world attackers are always trying to find new tricks to circumvent the mitigation solutions, and we routinely find holes in those mitigation solutions. Okay, so we saw a manual incident response. What does an automated pathway look like? As you might imagine, the process tends to be much simpler. Just as before, the incident is normally triggered by network monitoring systems or detected by a mitigation solution. Once triggered, alerts are generally sent to the organization's SOC, but the important point is that this is now a non-critical step. Instead, the critical path is the triggering of the mitigation solution. In our experience, the average is about 1 minute, with top performers appearing to be nearly instantaneous, and the bottom performers are usually no more than 10 minutes. In the automatic model, the alert validation step is bypassed outright, since it's basically assumed that the alert must be legitimate. So this step is instantaneous. And then the last step, the actual mitigation can vary a little bit. Again, this is primarily driven by the type of mitigation solution. If the solution still requires DNS or BGP changes, that's still going to eat up about 5 minutes or so of response time. On average, we see this step take about 5 minutes, but the top performers are often instant, and the low performers generally don't exceed 10 minutes due to the automation. Just like before, we should now be back online and protected, but just like before, we still have the same caveat, which is that the initial mitigation may fail and require manual adjustments. If this happens, the timing would be no different than our manual process, since that would be a manual intervention step at that point. Let's look at those times side by side. Now, the difference is remarkable, with average mitigation time dropping from 35 minutes to 6 minutes, and even in the top 5% group, we see a substantial improvement from 20 minutes to effectively instant. But I think the most striking thing is how much an automatic strategy can help the bottom 5% of performers. Sure, 20 minutes is still a long time to be offline, but it's far, far better than being offline for nearly 2 hours. Now consider back to the earlier slide where we talked about business impact, and consider how those times might affect that. Think of your own business and consider what these downtimes might mean, and ask yourself some key questions. Regarding revenue, of course you need to know how much money you lose per minute, and this can be calculated based off gross revenue numbers, but did you consider peak times? Many sites have critical time periods where revenue is at its highest, and this is often the time attackers select to maximize the impact of their attacks. The classic example of this in the e-commerce world is Black Friday or Cyber Monday prior to the Christmas holiday. Now, what about reputation damage? The key question there is, what happens when a customer can't reach your site? Do they go to a competitor? Within the SEO world, it's general knowledge that if a site doesn't load within just a few seconds, then a prospect will simply skip down to the next result in Google. What about existing customers who can't reach your site? Most businesses have an approximation of an acquisition cost for a new customer. So by being offline, this acquisition cost is actually being squandered, and you may never get that new customer, and the cost to development of an existing customer will end up being wasted. Next, lost productivity is the quiet killer with DDoS attacks. At most organizations, IT and engineering costs are one of the largest budget areas, and these groups are responsible for the technology that drives an organization forward. But DDoS attacks and other crisis response scenarios cause everyone to drop what they're working to focus on the immediate health of the business. This diverts attention from strategic projects, growth initiatives, and other projects that keep your business ahead of competitors. Quantifying those opportunity costs is nearly impossible, but I can't imagine that there's any CIO that wants their team distracted by a DDoS attack instead of working on proactive projects. Next, we have data theft. Companies have spent tens of millions of dollars remediating the impact of a data breach. Depending on your business and the nature of the data, a data breach could literally cause a company to close its doors. And even during a short attack, a massive amount of data can be stolen. An attacker could steal millions of credit card or financial records in just a couple minutes, while the defenders are distracted by a DDoS attack. So consider that when we talk about number of minutes offline. And lastly, what about regulations? In many cases, regulatory frameworks specifically state the uptime requirements of a system. And if you run afoul of these guidelines, you can expect costly fines and audits. And it's important that everyone be aware of what regulatory requirements that you have and how DDoS impacts them. For instance, most everyone is familiar with GDPR as a framework for data privacy. But what people often forget is that GDPR has a data availability component as well, which means that businesses must think of GDPR impact from a DDoS attack as well. So all that said, what does Nimbus DDoS recommend as a goal for mitigation? The goal should be instant. Now, it may take some time and there may be technical challenges that make this difficult, but every organization should target an instant response and mitigation. You saw some of the reasons on the last slide, but you should try to get an instant response for two main reasons. One, the cost of an outage is immense, sometimes to the point that it may cause a business to fail. And two, the ability to achieve an instant response is not so costly or challenging that it can't be achieved. There are vendors and technology that make this a reasonable goal. The top 5% that is already achieving instant response, they're not doing anything, they're not spending any more than the people that are in that bottom 5%. What they are doing is they are just making smart choices and selecting technology, people, and processes that are focused on that goal rather than building an expensive and ineffective ad hoc defense. It's actually the ad hoc defenses that become very expensive and tend to be the least effective. Now let's change topics a little bit. And going back to one of my earlier slides, people who are listening closely may have picked up on something that I skipped past on those previous slides. Specifically, what about the mitigation itself? In the review of the manual versus automatic, we were talking about this incident response procedures and not the actual mitigation. We just assumed that when the mitigation is active, that the environment is protected. And right there is the dirty secret of the DDoS mitigation industry. What is going on inside the hardware or inside the vendor scrubbing center? It's a bit of a black box. The short answer is that we see the same manual versus automatic behavior, and the times for each can vary significantly between vendors. In my experience, most mitigation vendors are very opaque in how they protect their customers. It's usually considered a bit of a trade secret, But through testing, we've been able to infer some behaviors. We break those behaviors apart into manual techniques and automated techniques. And it's worth noting that a mitigation vendor may have a mixture of multiple capabilities, with some automated and some manual. On this slide, I've listed some common manual mitigation concepts. The most common one that we see is the manual addition of access control lists and filters by a DDoS engineer at the vendor. This takes on average about 15 minutes, but often requires multiple iterations to refine the rules to minimize the loss of legitimate traffic. Another behavior that we see is that just because you're sending traffic through the vendor doesn't mean that they are blocking the attack. In some cases, an internal escalation occurs at the vendor in which they direct the traffic. First they detect the possible attack, and then a DDoS engineer investigates it, and then after they've confirmed it, internal routing is adjusted to direct the traffic through scrubbing equipment. Obviously, this is prone to human and process failures, just like the incident response procedures that we talked about earlier. Now, what do some of the automated techniques look like? Many are just the automated versions of what the DDoS engineer would do. So instead of adding manual filters, there are good default filters that block most common attacks, and there's packet validators that automatically block suspicious data. Now, these aren't perfect though, since an attack that isn't detected may still require manual filters. But what about if you could automate the engineer's behavior further? This is what the new AI and machine learning algorithms attempt to do. Rather than using simplistic filters and policies, these are looking at dynamic behaviors and creating filters in real time that are specific to a customer's unique environment. So what is the takeaway from this webinar? If the objective is to minimize business impact of a DDoS attack, then manual processes and manual mitigations are the antithesis of that objective. A few key areas are: 1, if possible, use always-on routing to avoid BGP conversion times. 2, embrace process automation. Automation generally reduces error and is much faster than an engineer acting manually. And 3, AI and machine learning will detect the most difficult attacks much quicker than an engineer manually analyzing traffic and manually filtering. And lastly, number 4, start with great default protection policies to block the obvious attacks. Some of these attacks that are out there have been out there for 15 years, and there's no reason not to have a good default policy that catches those. So that is the presentation. I want to thank everyone for attending. Again, please take note of my contact information. Feel free to drop me an email, connect with me on LinkedIn, however you like to keep in touch. And if you have any questions, certainly put them into the chat in the webinar, and I'll try to answer those right now. And if you have any other follow-up questions, or you want a copy of the slide deck or anything like that, by all means, just drop me an email and connect with me. So thank you very much. Let's take a look at some of those questions.